you said, my name's Fred Eck. I work for Gravitate Solutions as a senior software engineer, and most of the stuff I work on is with SQL Server, reporting services, integration services. Not so much anymore, but in the past I have. And then PowerBI is another thing that we use at work. We do a lot of stuff with nonprofits and associations with their memberships and events, registrations, sales, marketing, and things along those lines. And we have a service we call Agile Analytics that we use PowerBI to pull in data from a data connector that we've created to tie into one of our APIs, as well as to SQL Server itself. To analyze data, and we do it kind of on a weekly basis. And the reason we use Power BI on it is just a quick way to pull things together. And the desktop version is a free version. You have to start paying if you want to share your data with a bunch of different people, and then you push it up to the web service and everything. But for what we just use the desktop version to do the quick analysis. So they asked me to do a review of some of the Power BI stuff. There's a lot of different things in there, and they push out changes every month. Sometimes I think maybe even a little bit more than a month. All I know is every time it seems like I'm having to update it. For the most part, the updates don't affect things that I'm doing, but there are a few occasional things, and I'll go over some of those that change stuff quite a bit. But the forums and the support for Power BI, at least from my standpoint, have been really good. I've worked with Tableau on some stuff as well, and I've always had problems trying to find answers for some Tableau things versus Power BI. I haven't really had as many issues with some of those. So, and what I'm going to go over tonight is just kind of a demo using some baseball data. It's something that I've always been interested in and have worked on over the years. And so I'm going to kind of show you how I've pulled in some of the data and show some visualizations, which is what Power BI is mainly used for, is visualizations. So here's some of the data, baseball data from the MLB website. As you can see, it has a lot of different things in there, from the innings, at-bats, strikes, balls, pitches, and different descriptions. And I took integration services to pull data for all the different, this is just for like one game on this page, and it has a different page for each game. And so I just went through integration services, pulled all the different links for everything, and pulled down all the data into SQL Server. So in SQL Server, then it started to look, I had set it up with different dimensions and facts, the dimensions being the one starting with dim, and facts being the at-bats. And then I had created a couple views to kind of summarize a lot of it together. As you can kind of see at the bottom, that's kind of some of the raw data. So I pulled all the data together into SQL Server, and then I used Power BI to pull the data to be able to see it and do some analysis. And I'm going to kind of show you different ways to do some different things, but it won't all. I won't have examples of everything, but I'll try to show you what you can do. So in terms of getting the data, they have a lot of different data sets that are kind of pre-set up in terms of the connections, like CSV, XML, JSON, Excel, and all those typical things. SQL Server for the database, and then Azure. You can also create custom ones for yourself. That's what we've done at our work to connect to our API for that. And most of the connections are just pretty easy to put together. Let me see if I can.
So Fred, with those XML feeds, you could have pulled those directly in
I could have, and actually to like test some of that stuff out, I was starting to do that, but it just took a lot longer, and so and part of it too was I was trying to learn things on integration services at the time, so I didn't go with that. Plus, if I wanted to refresh some of the things in there, I felt like it was better to go through the integration services and put all the data in one spot rather than trying to use Power BI to pull all that in. But I have tried some of that, and it would be possible. It's just for the way I wanted to go about it, it wasn't probably optimal. I felt like if I had to refresh the data, it was going to have to go through and pull all that, and it's just going to take a long time. So yeah, it's just you put in the server name and then the database. The import is it'll import all the data directly into Power BI versus direct query means if you have a connection out to it, it will, whenever you do refreshes and things, it'll go straight out to the database and start pulling that stuff live in there, and then you can put in your SQL statements and everything as well. For all I did was I did my local database and those two things to pull in the data. And you can also create your own data sets just by entering data in there. If for some reason, I know we've done this at work where we had a certain region that we wanted for the United States, and it wasn't like in a table or anything. We just had it some information from the client designating certain states and certain regions, so we just typed those in for it. Or we could have gotten a CSV or text file and imported it that way. But as you can kind of see, here's that same raw data that was in SQL. It's the same information in there. And then at the bottom, it kind of summarizes some of the information. It's not all that large for that. What you can do then is you can start playing around with some of the visualizations. So all these visualizations are the ones that come kind of pre-installed. And I forgot to mention, it's just you just go out to the Microsoft Store in order to install the desktop version. It's free, like I said, for the desktop part itself. And there's all sorts of different ones, from pie charts, scatter plots, bar charts, line charts, and different things. There's also a lot of custom ones that have been built out there that you can go out to the store and pull those things in. I haven't done that. I also know there's a Python one here and an R as well. Those require additional scripting and things. I've done a little bit with that, but not too much, because my Python and R skills just aren't that great yet. But there are definite things, especially on R, that you can do some visualizations that you can't do through a lot of these. And so the visualizations really are usually pretty easy to put together. You can just drag them onto the screen, and then there's different categories based on what visualization you have. So there's rows and columns and values. Sometimes there'll be tooltips and things, and I'll show those in some of the other visualizations. And depending on how many different things you have and what visualization you're doing, it'll layer some of those that you can drill down into, and I'll show some of that as well. But in this case, what it's showing is just all the information aggregated by team, and then if I want to, because team is on top in the rows, if I want to go and drill in, then I can get the individual batters in this case. And if I started out, if I took home and away, that's kind of how it would have normally looked, and then I just usually added home and away as another column, and that just goes ahead and puts all that. It's a little bit slower, of course, if you have the direct query, but for most of the stuff I've ever done, I've always done an import. Sometimes it takes a little bit longer to import the data, but it's always been faster than, of course, on the visualizations. As you can see here, it's split it up into away and home, and then it has the totals over to the right. So that's kind of the matrix, and we often use this in our we put these at the bottom of our visualizations a lot of times when we're doing analysis, so that we can see the data as we're going through and analyzing it. It helps both us and the client see what makes up some of the data, because you can, if you click on some visualizations, it'll highlight the data that makes up part of that, and we'll use that to kind of verify some of the results. And then, like I said, there's various different visualizations. So like scatter plots are just kind of the normal thing. Here I've put like a trend line. There's a lot of different pieces and attributes that you have access to. Again, for most of what we're doing, I don't tend to change a lot of the stuff, but if you're publishing out to the web service and then creating dashboards for end users to you have a lot of access to do some of those things. On this one, you can see the x-axis and the y-axis for at-bats and hits, and then split up by teams. Let me see if I can make the size. Yeah, the size is a little bit bigger there. But it has a lot of different pieces on there. The play axis on this one is if you had a time dimension that you wanted to add, you can add that in, and it will do kind of a movie of it, and it'll show how all the different bubbles change over your period of time. So it helps in kind of seeing how certain things might move from one side to another over time, which can provide some additional information that you might not have realized otherwise. And here's one just on some of the stats. So this one's like hits by month, and this is, yeah, they've changed things. So for instance, all these things used to be up at the top left, and now for whatever reason, at least in this version, now they're down at the bottom right. So that's some of the changes that they kind of do that throw me off a little bit. But the nice part is over here on the axis I have the date, and it'll go ahead, and if it's a specific date object from SQL Server, it'll go ahead and pull in a hierarchy for the year, quarter, month, day. It doesn't pull in hour, minute, or second, but if you wanted to pull those out, you can create some functions that'll pull those things, and then you can add them in to that as well. For what I'm doing, it wasn't necessary, but you can drill in, and there's different ways to drill in. One is by going, and I don't have multiple years worth of data, so it's not as helpful in this one, but you can split it up by like quarter, month, day, and see kind of how some of those things interact. And this one over here, in this case, it's going to show the same thing, but the difference between these two is if you had multiple years, this one would aggregate all the data by just like that quarter, versus this one where it splits it out into separate levels. It would have like 2015, quarter one, quarter two, quarter three, quarter four, and then it would have 2016, quarter one, quarter two, quarter three, quarter four, and it would keep splitting those out, so it'd get wider and wider on that. So that's nice to see some trends, but sometimes you're also wanting to look at like, well, how are things, what are our more popular months for at work? It might be for registrations on events and things like that, and what we'll see is a lot of times certain events in the winter might be more popular because they're in more like Florida or Hawaii or California or things like that, where people want to travel more, versus some of the things in the summer and stuff like that. One of the things though that you have to keep in mind when working on that is the granularity that you're working with. So all the data that I was working with is in this data set is based on at-bats and hits and outs and things like that. So in this other one here, the thing you have to watch if you're not careful is if you just do like values, in this case is a count, it'll pull in all the counts of all those things at that granularity. So you might want to do like a distinct so that you don't get duplicates in those. So this one basically shows all the different teams that they played in those particular months. And rather than showing each time that they played, it just shows that they played that team once per month. And then, so one of the neat things too, this is on a specific batter in this case. And I've got multiple visualizations. So I've got, in this case, it was a bar chart with some lines and a pie chart, and then this tree map. And one of the other things that's really nice is if you click on some of these, it'll interact and show like, well, what makes up. In this case, I clicked on the home portion of hits for this this individual. So now you can see the highlighted areas down below. These are the different pitchers that pitched, as you can see kind of by the tooltip that I hovered over. And then the highlighted sections, it'll show you how many hits they had at home for that particular individual. And then you can do the same thing away. And it's kind of nice. It'll re-aggregate some of the different things as well. So like on the line, I don't know if you'd watched, but it'll change the average that's shown for those. And the same thing, you can click on some of these other ones and then it'll show the different pieces there. So that's a nice way to kind of interact with the data to see some things that maybe aren't as obvious overall, and we use that with our clients a lot of times to see like online sales versus offline sales, and over time where those are, and then we might create a separate visualization based on the results of those. And then this is just another one that I created, and this is kind of shows how we normally do things, where I have the results at the bottom so that I can click on some of the different things top, and then it'll filter down the results in the bottom part. So here's where I can see where this particular person had an at-bat that resulted in an error from an individual in those cases. So that's how we use to verify data. It's a nice tool to help verify some of that, or at least bring up things. We'll often do, you can create different measures and formulas to help verify that. So for instance, there's what they call quick measures, and in here you can do different calculations, and it'll basically put a lot of that stuff together for you, so you can kind of do a year to date, and then you can pull your pieces of data over into these spots so that it'll create the measure for you really quick. That's how I did the batting average one. So I don't know if it'll show. Yeah, it doesn't show how to edit it.
Actually, if you go into your data section, you won't be able to see the formula in the DAX.
Oh, and the.
If you go into your data section and then click on your measure, you should be able to see your DAX. The DAX.
Yep.
There you go.
Yep. So in these, you can use the DAX to pull to put together the formulas for that. I'm not as familiar with DAX. I've done it for a few different things, and I know it's used a lot in analysis services. I'm just not as, I would say, fluent in some of it, but I'm usually able to, if I can figure out what I'm trying to solve, I can usually go out to the PowerBI forums and pull that stuff together. And then I don't know if it'll show. Yeah, if you had certain queries and things. Let me see. You can go kind of behind the scenes a little bit, and if you wanted to, you can add additional steps that apply. So if you wanted, you could filter down additional things on the back end, so they never get pulled into the front. If you have errors, it'll show the percentage kind of errors in the results is like a little red bar here. So then you can go back and research, or you can pull those out. So that's kind of nice. And then I've done things where I've split the results if you wanted to. Yeah, it's not going to do it on this one. Yeah, I can do different text filters, and there's a way to split based on commas or things like that if you wanted to, but I don't remember that off the top of my head. And there's other things where you can pass in parameters for your data sets and things like that to help manage some of that. That's actually what I was doing when I was doing the XML and putting in the URLs for all those different ones, was using parameters then in functions to set up the days for the year, and then pulling those, and then pulling that part out and ripping out the names of the teams and things like that. But I don't have that example in here. And then one of the cool things, sorry for jumping around here. It'll pull together all the different relationships. The nice part on this too is, like, if you have different data sets and it doesn't automatically pull those together, then you can put the IDs and create those relationships here to tie things together. One of the cooler functions that I found a few months ago was being able to tie dashboards from different sheets from one to the other, so that I could drill in to those results. So if I had, like you'd seen here, I had some team statistics and then I had individual statistics, but I don't want to have to do that for every individual, of course. So they've done some additional options on drill through capability, to where if I set it up as cross reports with some additional features in there, then I can right click on like a team and I can go drill through. I'm going to pick a different one, so that's the one that's already there. And then I can do like team stats, and it'll go ahead and pull that stuff in there. So that was one of the newer things that I found interesting, because I just didn't have to recreate or didn't have to adjust the filters and things along those lines. And the same thing goes for like individuals. It depends on what you can drill in, of course, based on how you've set up your visualizations. And then you can see here like how it's filtered those things down. And one of the newer ones too that they've added within the last couple months is this filter pane. You can throw filters on the page directly. No, it won't. It's not wanting to. Yeah, I could throw a filter directly on the page if I wanted, but anymore I've started just putting them on here so that I can hide them when I don't want to see them, to save space. Before, you just had to put them on kind of the page or apply them to the visualizations and things themselves. And you can apply your filters based on for all of the data across the board, or you can do it on a per page or per visualization. So there's a lot of different options on that, but you just have to remember kind of how you've set those up. We've been caught sometimes where we'll apply it to a whole page in one set, and then go to another page and assume it's applying it for the whole workbook itself, and it's not, and then you kind of get confused on some of those things. anyway, there's a lot of different options in there. I'm just kind of showing some of the basics of different things. There's an ask a question thing where you can start typing in kind of natural language things, and then it can give you some suggestions on visualizations. There's also, I can't remember where that is, but you can do some analysis where it'll show increases from one month to the next, and it'll give you some additional visualizations that might be helpful to show some of those things. So you can.
Question
Yep.
on this. This is done through Power BI. You did not set this up, correct?
These where I right clicked on them.
Yep.
Yep.
Yep. So that's simply done through Power BI.
Right. Yeah, it goes through and kind of analyzes it and pulls out. Sometimes there'll be, like in this case, there were 4
I noticed
different
that.
things,
Yeah.
but and depending on how much data you have in there, you might get 10. And a lot of times it's like, well, this isn't really helpful, and maybe more confusing, but it makes it a little bit easier not to have to do all that analysis. So. Anyway, kind of went through it a little fast, but hopefully it shows kind of the basics on it. You guys have questions? Yep, Mike.
What are your options for sharing it?
So, like I said, I've just used the desktop version, so just the local one, but I know you can have a web service, I think it's all out on Azure, that you can publish it out to, and then you have to set up security in groups and things like that to be able to share to different people, and I know there's a lot of stuff that you can lock down visualizations or pages or stuff based on all that. I haven't actually done any of that. At least we had me and Chad worked together on something, and I think at the time when we worked on it a few years ago, I think there was a server option for some of those things, and we
There
were able
actually
to set
still
that.
is.
Okay.
And Power BI Premium, that's where you would go out to Azure, but now Microsoft also, through the Power BI Pro, you can have your own dedicated server, or you can have what they call on-premises gateway.
Okay.
To where then you can have as an internal environment, rather than always going out to Azure and then coming back into
Okay.
so you've got these 3 layers now, and that's kind of a little different from in the beginning when they first put out Power BI.
Right. Okay.
Mike, another option is you can just send a PBIX file, an
Oh,
Excel
yeah.
file. You can just send that file to somebody as long as they have access to data sources, so they're on the same network, or if your data sources are text files or something, they can open that file up on their
You can send a
Can
template
you-
for the file, or you can send the whole file with the data included in it.
Or if you're
Yeah, the PBIX file is the full file with the data, and I think it's a PBIT for the template, where it'll show,
Okay.
it'll give all the things, and then it doesn't have the data, but then you can have them refresh the data on their
So
side.
the PBIX has just the latest snapshot when you say
Right.
Okay.
At least from my experience.
Now,
If
is
you're
it
just sharing one-to-one, that's a good solution.
Yeah.
Now, I have a question. Even if you do share one-to-one, is it possible to have the data out in SharePoint, and then when you and then load the PBIX in SharePoint, and then if someone else pulls that down to view it, would it still keep that connection to the data files that are stored in SharePoint? So if I have a SharePoint folder and load up, let's say, my Excel files and all my source files, and then the PBIX, if someone pulls down that PBIX, would that be able to pull in the data that would be stored out in that SharePoint folder? Has anyone tried that?
I don't know, I haven't done that.
Okay, no, I'm curious because when I was at Mercy, I used Power BI to do a lot of geocoding, and geomapping of patient data. And what happened was I ended up producing the maps in Power BI and then doing Snagit, of all things, to grab the image and then put it into a PowerPoint presentation for my manager, who would then take it and run with it, because Power BI was not what they call official IT program. So, okay, so I'm one of these nasty end users, folks, that I wanna use what I wanna use. But no, it made sense because, in Power BI, you have the, Esri,
Right.
mapping module, which is so awesome when you're trying to get down to such a linear, zip code level, and you're trying to just getting it, to aggregate the data to that, level. I ended up having to go further deeper than that, and get into the blocks and all like that, but that was total chaos. I won't do mapping 70,000 patients again that way, thank you.
If you wanna get it out in the PowerPoint, is taking a screen image the only way, or does it support?
It does PDF.
It does PDF.
Now it does PDF, but when I was using it, there wasn't any way. So what I was doing to get the cleaner image at the time was using a snapshot, or I used a software called Snagit because it allows me to actually put additional features on top of the image, which is what I was trying to also emphasize. So no, that was just my quick handy solution.
Yeah.
I guess I had one question too. How many of you guys have used Power BI? Okay.
I have
Yep.
a question. It sounds like you can connect Power BI to flat files and spreadsheets and SQL Server.
Mhm.
Can it plug into cloud APIs at all? Like, can it integrate with APIs? And if so,
yeah,
do
and
the
some
APIs
stuff is already set up. Like I think, and some things are in beta version. Like SurveyMonkey, I think, is one that they have in beta, and
So a
Yeah, let me see.
RESTful API
Yes.
can give you like JSON responses. It's
Uh-huh.
really, really easy to connect to. Where it gets complicated is if there's paging involved. So you have to get kind of creative in writing your script to say, grab pages 1 through n until there's the rows.
which is what we used to do at our work. Was we had our API page, and then I created a function that went through the paging for that and stopped when it wasn't returning data.
Okay.
Now we've created our own data connector, so we can just hit that. We don't have to.
You don't have to worry about the paging. And so when you say you've created your own data connector, is that different from a REST API? Or is that an API
It's just
designed
calling- it's-
specifically for?
It was calling it out and hitting it directly in
It's
a
basically
different
it's
way.
basically a Power BI plugin, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Huh,
That's the
okay.
connector.
Cool, thanks.
Fred, is it easy just to show how you create one of those from scratch? Like if I wanted to know how many at-bats each player had in the season or whatever the time frame is?
Yeah, so usually what I'll do is I'll kind of start with this.
Yeah.
Oops. And I can pull in different things, starting with kind of my raw data set for there. But
So if I just want like a sum of bats by player.
yeah, so
I'm just, if that's a, I'll check and see what it might take for us to make our API Power BI.
Oh, okay, all right, no, I was just
For sure.
The way that I explain it is that this is an easy way to do a pivot table or pivot table visualization
Right.
with multiple different sources. So it's basically marrying Excel with Access and letting it mature a little bit.
Except you have to pay for Excel.
Well, I mean, yeah, but
This
at the
one's-
same time, even after a little bit of time, you're going to want to pay for Excel, but the amount you have to pay per year is less than the cost of Excel.
Oh, no, I wasn't complaining about Excel. I like Excel. I was just saying this one's free.
This one's
So you
free
can skip
if
the
you
Excel
don't want
step.
to
But
share
just
it.
one- just one
Right.
pivot table
Yeah.
and all that.
But it's
Yes,
not on
but-
Mac, right?
but the, oh
I
no,
don't-
Does it?
Is it?
no, you can download it from the App Store, the Power BI, I think it's a viewer, but I think to do the desk, I don't know.
I actually thought that it was available for everything except for Google OS.
Really?
That,
yeah, I don't know.
because I know at one point in time, very early on when I was using the way back when in the early stages, I remember seeing a Power BI app for the Mac and as well as Windows, and they've also got it for mobile too. So I'm now starting to experiment with some stuff I did for class to see how it looks like on mobile actually. So it should be interesting to see. But what they do recommend is that you do all your visualizations in the desktop, on the laptop, or on the computer, but do it in desktop because you can't generate or create any visuals through the mobile app. The mobile app really is more of what I would call a viewer more so than anything else, but it does and will allow you to view any dashboard or scorecard or anything that someone's put up through Power BI service. You'll be able to view that on your mobile phone.
Sorry, I was trying to put together some stuff just to show kind of how easy it is to
Yeah.
throw some of those things. Any other questions?
Oh, no, that is cool. Sorry, I'm a baseball fan. I'm sitting here praying for my Nationals. Sorry.
You don't have to pray too
Keep on
hard.
praying.
What? What? No comment.
What was most, like, were there any kind of gotchas, or what was sort of most difficult for you to figure out when you started working with the application? Like light bulbs
So,
go off.
the difficult, as with like most of my experience on pulling stuff together, is like actually getting the data in the format and the way I want. So that's why I went with integration services to pull it down into SQL Server. Like like Chad had mentioned, I could have gone through the pulled them all as XML files directly into Power BI, but that was just not really feasible from what I'd seen in that. The other thing too is, especially if you're pulling from some of the APIs, you don't get what the data type is. It'll just come across as text. So then when you go in and you do your edits in the queries, you can set what the data type is there. But that can be time consuming if you've got a lot of different columns and things.
So you gotta
Sometimes
watch
it's-
that, or it doesn't know what it is. It doesn't.
Right, it'll set it as text by default. It
Yeah.
sets it as a text number thing, basically an unknown type of
General.
thing, and then you have to go in and set it, versus if you're going against SQL or something where it can determine what those data types are, then it'll go ahead and do a lot of that for you.
Things like case-sensitive text and stuff like that, you really have to watch your data types, because you're grouping by a text field, and there's different casing on that, and it will segment those as separate, even though it's the same value. So you want to create like a computed field that's lowercase or uppercase version.
The other hard parts I've had is just doing some of the DAX functions, and that's just because I'm not as familiar with a lot of those functions, and I'm still kind of learning some of that. I mean, there's a lot of powerful things in it. I'm just not up to speed on some of those. Still
If
learning.
anyone used Power Pivot through the Excel, either Excel 2010, 2013, and on up, if you've used the data modeling function in Power Pivot and through the Excel add-ins, then DAX is exactly the same as it is in Power BI as it is in Excel. Okay, and if you've ever used Power Query, that's when they talk about pulling your data into Power BI from the Power add-ins in Excel, what we call Power Query, same thing as it is here. So Microsoft really took those Power add-ins that they had created originally for Excel and basically plugged them into this application and just basically enhanced it, glorified it, made it far more powerful. Unfortunately, that's the world I've come from. I actually learned DAX through the Power Pivot and the data modeling through the Power add-ins through Excel. So when I came over here to Power BI Desktop, it was almost second nature.
Right.
So just as a FYI for anyone who's used those functions, you're going to find Power BI quite friendly.
That's helpful.
The data
Yeah, and you can, once you get your data sets down to what you want, if you need to hand it off to somebody, we've done this with our client too, is export the data out and everything. And there's other options here, like you can see the clusters and stuff like that, where it'll do some analysis to try to cluster some things that are related, but I haven't really done much of that.
When you say export data, why would you export the data out of Power BI, or unless you're just using Power BI to assemble the data, manipulate it, and then extract it? Is that what you mean?
Right.
Oh, okay.
Well, and in some cases, like for our one of our clients, they were asking, they wanted to see some of the stuff that we'd filtered everything down through some of the visualizations. They wanted to see what those specific results were, so they could do some additional analysis on their own.
Okay. All right. Kind of like
And
validation
they weren't
type
using,
of stuff.
yeah, and they weren't using the desktop part at that point. They just wanted to use wanted to get the data itself.
Gotcha.
How did you learn the application?
We had some what was it? We had some clients that were wanting to do some analysis. It was right when Power BI was pretty new. So we were trying it out to see how. We didn't want to go with Tableau because of costs. We wanted to try out the Power BI. We had heard of some things on it, and the training really, a lot of it's pretty intuitive, and it's like she said, a lot of it is similar to Excel in terms of creating some of your charts and stuff like that. So it really wasn't all that hard. It's when you try to create additional functions on the back end to loop over data sets and do additional things. That got a little bit more complicated, but for those things, I've just gone to the forums. They've got I think it's community.powerbi.com is what the forum is, and there's been a lot of good examples in those. I think there was an edX training session that I took too, but it didn't go over much more than what I had already kind of learned.
There's a YouTube channel for Power BI as well, and then there's also a Power BI users group website. Crumbs. I've got my list somewhere, but if anyone's interested, I can take your emails and I can zap you my list of references that I use if anyone's curious.
Could you post it to the meetup comments for this event?
Yeah, I can do that. I'll do that instead.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
It's
the
pretty
user group in Norway is actually pretty active, and they do a monthly webinar that is at night for them, but like during the middle of the day for us. So it's easy to actually dial in and watch them, because they're actually presenters from Seattle, but presenting for people in Norway is their primary group, but it's still the same thing.
I'm curious
Yep.
to know about that.
So, all these tables are mapping back to database. Looks like you can get pretty complex with the filters and how you're joining them.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just get a SQL query out of it? Can it tell you, here's a query that gets the same data as what you've just set up from these joins and filter?
Not that I'm aware of.
I just think that'd be pretty nice, especially
If
when
it
you
could
said you
take
had
like the
clients who wanted
filters
to
and
know
go ahead and
how you
apply it.
got to stuff.
Yeah.
It also doesn't assume that those are SQL tables. Like once
Yeah.
they're in there, they're just tables.
I know, I'm just digging into it because we saw what you worked with.
Mm. Yeah, and in this case, I'm just pulling I put it all into view to tie it all together, but the same data is in these other dimensions and fact tables. I could have done it without it, but. And I didn't pull any other data sets other than the SQL for it. But I mean, there's a lot of stuff I'd like to do on the data set. I just haven't pulled in some of the data for that. So that was one of the key things too. Like there was information about every pitch that was thrown in there. I could have thrown that in there and done analysis on the speed of the pitch and the the type of pitch and stuff, but that's additional level of granularity then that, at least for what I was doing, I wasn't interested at the time. And then I would have to rerun everything again to pull all that.
Anything
Alright,
else?
well, I used most of the time. I know you guys had a few other things you wanted to go over, so.
This is pretty impressive. I was looking at how complicated